Hey guys, welcome back to Project Bodybuilding, and welcome back to another episode of my Road to the New York Pro series. And I'm going to go ahead and call this episode 4 since I'm counting the podcast I did with AJ Kelly Robber as an episode of the series. You can watch that episode by clicking up in the corner, by the way. But anyway, this is a big episode. For the longest time, this was hyped up as the matchup for the New York Pro, with both of these guys giving each other plenty of trash talk and banter on social media. Now, I don't know if that's still the case. I think a new top challenger has emerged to take on the favorite heading into the show, but we'll discuss both of these matchups eventually. In this video, we will be comparing Tonio Burton versus Nick Walker. Now, Nick Walker is still the favorite to win the show. Even after what most people said about the guest posing he just did, I think most of us still agree that Nick is in the driver's seat. But like I said, Tonio announced that he was doing the show early on in order to defend his title that he won in 2023. And since then, he and Nick Walker have been talking smack. All in good fun, of course. It's almost time to put up and shut up, though. So before we get there, let's get a little preview. In this video, we'll compare Tonio's most recent version, the 2024 Arnold Brazil, against Nick Walker's latest version, the 2023 Arnold Classic. I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for using this version of Nick, since the 2022 Olympia version is more faithful to what we'll probably get on the New York Pro stage, but I really want to make this comparison interesting, because to be honest, I don't think Tonio would stand a chance against Nick Walker's Olympia version. Even his 2023 Arnold Classic version is going to be hard for Tonio to topple. So let's handicap Nick. Why not? Let's make this even more interesting and more favorable to Tonio. Anyway, that's enough intro. Let's go ahead and jump into today's video. We'll be comparing two New York Pro champions to see which one comes out on top. Here is Nick Walker versus Tonio Burton. If you guys like these types of videos and want to see more of this series, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Starting with the front double, we have some good poses for sure. However, just take a look at the difference in size. These guys are roughly the same height. I believe Tonio competes in the 220s though, if I'm not mistaken. Nick's smallest version wasn't anything less than 245, if I'm remembering correctly. And even then, I'm probably undershooting that. And just think about the size Nick has been able to put on since then. That's going to be Tonio's biggest hurdle, getting over that next level size. That's going to be the question in just about every pose. Does Tonio outshape and or outdetail Nick enough to win in these shots? Well, the first one, I would say no. Let's just go body part for body part for a second. We can start in the arms because Tonio does have solid peaks, but he's going up against Nick Walker, who has some of the best arms of all time. So Nick wins a big piece of the pose by a lot, but let's continue down. I have Nick winning in the lats as well. They're lower inserting and wider than Tonio's. And in the midsection, I don't think this is actually a big win for Tonio. I'm contemplating if it's even a win at all. He's doing a half vacuum kind of thing, which isn't my forte, but we see the outlines of his abs too, so that's a plus. But Nick has those deeply etched abs, although he could have crunched down on them a little bit more. Overall, I would probably still go with Tonio, but not by as much as you'd expect. And then for the overall torso, I would have Nick probably winning. I think it's because Tonio doesn't have those really wide lats, so his waist, although smaller than Nick's, isn't that small compared to his lats. So he doesn't really have the best illusion. That's basically what I'm trying to say. And finally, when you get to the legs, do you guys want to hear a hot take? I have Nick. To me, I love seeing great separation in the quads, which Tonio sorely lacks, but his sweeps are so impressive. I think if he just had 5% better separation, I'd like his legs more. But for now, I think Nick has a lot of development. Maybe not a whole lot of sweep, but there's plenty of mass there. And again, his legs are more detailed. He also has the better calves for what it's worth. I completely understand if you have Tonio here, but personally, I like Nick. So overall, when going body part for body part, Nick is winning most things, if not everything, but what gets him into trouble is the overall outline because he's a bit top heavy. But I think Tonio is the opposite, which isn't exactly better. With Tonio's great quad sweep and lack of width in the shoulders and lats, and just overall the upper body being less filled in than the legs, he looks a little bottom heavy. Both of these guys' overall X-frames are being slightly thrown off. However, Nick's upper body is more impressive than Tonio's lower body, I will say that. And honestly, if you really dissected these guys and measured them with the protractor on your screen, and measured the angle of everything, I think you'd find Nick would have just as good of an X-frame as Tonio per the numbers. But to the human eye, Tonio does look better. I think we can all agree that he does have the more pleasing shape. But Nick is just a monster. He's detailed and his hardness and dryness is there, and he beats Tonio in a lot of these body parts. So overall, I'm giving Nick this win. Not by an overwhelming margin, but I think this one is fairly clear. Tonio has a smaller waist, but what else? I don't see any other arguments. Shape is a big piece of the puzzle though, so I'm going to limit Nick's margin. He's not winning this by a full 3 points, instead just 2. But Tonio claps back with an even more dominating win than Nick's was in the front double. Nick's front lat spread sucks, and even in this recent update pic I put up, you can tell he has really improved the execution on this one, but he will clearly always have some structural limitations, preventing him from even being average in this pose. For Tonio, on the other hand, I think it's his best pose. Tonio is clearly smaller, the size difference is staggering, but Tonio overperforms so well in the shape department that it doesn't matter. Nick's balance issue will be on full display still when he hits this on show day. The stubby legs will still be present. But when Tonio spreads his wings and his shoulders, he looks looks wider up top to match his legs on the bottom, so he has the better upper and lower body balance in this pose. Anyway, I don't really think I need to go on. I say this in every comparison with Nick Walker. This is one pose where Nick cannot bully his way to winning through size and conditioning alone. The shape is too much of a flaw for him and too much of a plus for Tonio. Now, I did contemplate knocking this down to a 2-point win because I thought the size was enough to account for something for Nick, but no, I don't think so anymore. Not when you lose shape by an infinite amount. So Tonio will clap back with a 3-point win. For the side chest, I'm just going to keep this simple. Nick Walker is massive. Again, the size advantage is clear. He wins literally everything because of it. The arm, the delt, side leg, everything except the chest. This has been a common problem for Nick. He looks like a tank in this one, but his pecs have always been one of his weaker body parts. They flatten out in this pose especially. And for Tonio, he doesn't have the strongest pecs, but they're still beating Nick's. They have more pop and even more detail to them. And really, even though Tonio loses every other body part, he's still solid everywhere. Nick just happens to be on another level. For Tonio, he does have a lot of roundness in the delt, the arm, and he has a dry side leg. So Tonio does have a solid pose, and he wins the pecs. Nick has the overall better pose, however, on a per body part basis, and just from the basis of looking thick overall from the side. So surprisingly, even with the 30 pounds weight advantage, this one isn't a clean sweep for Nick. This is actually fairly close because Tonio's upper body is so round and so full, and that includes the pecs. What sells me on Nick is the level of mass overall, the hardness, and again, winning all these body parts. But I gotta be honest, I could probably go with Tonio in some cases if we kept running this scenario. For now, I'm going with Nick, but just by 1 point. But keep in mind, if I did give this to Tonio, it would also just be by a 1-point margin. So this is a less impactful pose either way. So don't think I'm trying to hurt Tonio here. It's close, but this time I'm giving it to Nick, just by a singular point. And moving on to what is probably the main event of this comparison, the rear double. Both of these guys have tremendous backs, some of the best in open. I would say both of them are in the top 5 of today's current roster. So let's break this one down because each gentleman does not disappoint. Now firstly, let me say I have 2 photos for Nick, and we'll get to the second one in a moment. You'll see why I chose to do this. Anyway, something I can decide very easily is the lower body. Nick has one of the best sets of hamstrings in the world right now. I'd say the best, honestly. Hopefully the hamstring tear hasn't hurt him, but based on what we saw at the guest posting, I'd say he's alright. And just right now, between these photos, Nick is lapping Tonio in the hamstrings. It's not even close. And while Tonio may have really developed and boxed in glutes, he doesn't have those neat striations. But that's okay because neither does Nick. But because Tonio's are a bit more developed, I'd give him the edge here. And in the quad sweeps, I legitimately have Nick winning. I know, what a surprise, but I think it has to do with Tonio's narrow posing. So overall, Nick takes a dominant win in the lower body. The glutes are close, but the hamstrings and quad sweeps are not. So Nick basically wins half the pose, but let's move on to the back. Now, I don't like this photo for Nick. I think it's hiding a lot of his back detail, and you can see what I mean when we switch to the other photo. There's not a big difference, and honestly this photo is in worse quality, but I think it's a more accurate representation of what Nick's back actually looks like. So anyway, who's taking the most important piece of the rear double pose? The back. Both gentlemen have fantastic backs, however I do think Nick has the slight upper hand here. Tonio's back is very dry, crisp, and detailed. Nick's back is also pretty dry, but there's just a different level of thickness and density going on here. He also has the grainier quality to him as well. But I would say Tonio's back is more aesthetically pleasing and symmetrical, as well as being very detailed himself. So in the back itself, I can also go with Tonio. But I've always liked that rugged look to Nick's back. So overall, this is a coin flip. And while we're in the upper body, we can go ahead and add the arms and delts in Nick's column. Tonio has good peaks on the buys, and his delts are always popping, but Nick is clearly on another level in all aspects, from delt separation and mass to those freaky bicep peaks. Anyway, the back was definitely a battle, but the lower body and the arms and delts were not. Nick won the lower body clearly, and to me, he won the back by a little. But I think even if Tonio won the back, it wouldn't be by much anyway. And because he lost so bad in the lower body, I'd still probably end up giving this overall pose to Nick, because Nick has the greater average between the upper and lower body. To me, the back is the most important part of this pose, but it is still an overall pose. So with the back being 50-50 and everything else being a dominant win for Nick, I have Nick winning, but only by a singular point. And keep in mind, this would also be another one of those poses that, had I given it to Tonio, would also still be a 1-point win. Now in the rear lat spread, let's go over what's the same from the last pose first, that being the lower body. We still have a big victory here for Nick, so again, his floor is a lot higher in this pose, even if he messes things up in the back, which I do think he does a little bit. This is Nick Walker's second worst pose for sure, along with the front lat spread being first. Now I do think he's improved. It looked really good at the guest posting, but we can't use that version, so we have to go off what we have here. And let me just come out and say it, I have Tonio winning the back portion of this pose. All that density and thickness that Nick had in his back in the last pose just completely disappears when he spreads his wings, and he's not really that wide either. Tonio is is wider surprisingly, and I think that's fairly apparent. His traps are more defined, and overall his back is the one looking denser now. Those lats are incredibly thick looking, while Nick's look a little flimsy in this one. And another big selling point for Tonio is his taper. Nick is okay, but Tonio's lat to waist ratio is extremely impressive. He has that aesthetically pleasing V shape. So this back pose is a little bit different from the last. I had Nick winning the back personally, but it was 50-50 in the last one, and I had him winning the lower body easily. Now I have Tonio winning the back in this pose, at least somewhat noticeably, not by huge margin still, but then of course he loses the lower body. The back is the most important piece of the pose, but like I said, I do look at the whole pose. However, given that both of these back poses were so close, I'm giving the edge to Tonio this time around. I think he could have won the rear double, and I think he could also lose this one. I think he does do enough in the back to win, but just because these poses are close, I'm fine with them splitting them because they were both razor thin. So to reflect that, I'm going to give Tonio 1 point here in the rear lat spread to match Nick's 1 point in the rear double, because I know plenty will disagree with my call on that pose. Now going back to the side, we're also going back to a pretty easy Nick win. Now I don't like using this pick because he's turned away from the camera, but we know Nick has one of the best side tricep poses in open bodybuilding right now. Him and Hunter are quite literally the best in this pose, bar none. And Tonio, not so much. Tonio doesn't really snap this pose very well. He rolls his shoulder forward, and that's a no-go for a shorter, narrower, and less muscular guy like him. His pecs aren't that impressive, neither is his width, and his posing doesn't help those things. So he's missing the important aspect of the pose by looking thick, but streamlined at the same time. That half hourglass shape, if you will. And Nick just wins a lot of body parts on top of winning the overall outline. He wins the tricep by a bit. Tonio has a longer inserting tricep and some good size there, but Nick has that thicker horseshoe, and I'm more of a fan of that shape. Nick also wins the midsection. He's keeping it tight and locked in, and his abs are much deeper than Tonio's. And finally, Nick wins in the side leg too. Even with Nick turning his leg away from the camera, we can see he has more size, and look at all the lines in the leg and that grainy quality. So overall, Nick wins a lot of body parts here, probably everything but the pecs, because his do flatten out a lot. And overall, he does manage to look thick and streamlined. He wins the tricep too, so he wins both major aspects of this pose. I gotta be honest, I don't think I'd ever give Tonio this pose, so I thought about a 2-point win for Nick because Tonio is still decent, but being decent doesn't mean you have a chance to win the pose. To me, I'm always going with Nick on this one. He wins both of the major aspects and then some. I gotta give him a 3-point win in this one. Definitely a step up from the last side pose. The abs and thighs is actually a pleasant surprise for the quote-unquote fridge, the brick, whatever you want to call Nick Walker. But legitimately, he does win this pose. Now, Tonio's photo isn't the best. It's also from the 2023 New York Pro. But with the lighting and his peak there, I don't really think that's too much of a detriment to Tonio. So anyway, let's break down both the abs and thighs portions of the pose. For the abs, I think it's pretty clear. I have Nick all day long. Nick had his stomach in check for this Arnold for sure. There isn't a hint of distension, and the waistline itself doesn't look that thick, especially compared to some of his other versions. So from just a pure waistline and upper body taper aspect, Nick isn't that bad. Tonio isn't stellar here. His lats look good, but his waist protrudes a little bit when he crunches down on those abs, a lot like Dexter Jackson's used to. Just another similarity between those two. But still, I would give Tonio the overall upper body taper just by a hair, which is surprising. But for the actual abs themselves, it's not close, even with Tonio's 8-pack. Nick's abs are just so deeply etched, and they're blockier than Tonio's, which in this case for this muscle group is a good thing. So overall, I have Nick winning the abs portion of the abs and thighs pose, even when we include the upper body taper and waistline. Tonio doesn't do enough in the aspects he won to overcome Nick's bullying in the ab development department. Now in the lower body, I also gotta go with Nick. The angle definitely doesn't help Tonio, let me say that. His quads would probably look a lot better from a head-on angle, that way he could expose Nick's lack of sweep, but I'm kinda gonna say what I said in the front double. Nick doesn't have a lot of sweep, but the quads are pretty developed, and his separation is deeper than Tonio's. But let's just go ahead and say Tonio does win the quads, why not? Nick is honestly still within striking distance. I'm not going to pretend he's not, sorry not sorry. So even if Tonio won the quads, it wouldn't be by much, and Nick won his area, the abs, by more than Tonio would win his area, that being the quads. It goes back to being a sum of parts, and this is another where Nick is better on average when combining both elements. And if you're like me, you're going to say he picks up the quads by a hair and wins both areas anyway. But even if you guys aren't in my frame of thinking, Tonio's minor win and the quads just isn't enough. Nick wins the abs and thighs. Now for the margin, I went back and forth on this one between 1 and 2 points. I don't think 3 is in order because I imagine there are enough people out there that would say Nick's waist is just too wide to win this one. But are there so many people giving this pose to Tonio that it would be a 1-point win? I don't think so. It's not exactly a coin flip. Nick wins this one convincingly, but he's not perfect given his structural flaws. So for now, I'm settling on a 2-point win. And finally, for the last pose, the most muscular, do I really need to spell it out? This was always going to be a Nick Walker win. Just take a look at these two versions against Tonio's. Nick is just so much bigger everywhere you look. Again, it's hard to compete when you're getting outmassed by 20, 30, maybe even 40 pounds. And I don't think Tonio does anything else enough to win. However, I do think he does enough to slightly limit Nick's margin. Now, this is another photo from the 2023 New York Pro, but again, I don't think this is to his detriment. With the peak and the lighting, this was a good package. Anyway, Tonio is really impressive because of his great fullness and 3D muscle. It's really noticeable noticeable throughout the upper body. The delts are popping, the traps are as well, and the chest looks pretty good here. But again, even if Tonio picked off a couple of body parts, let's say the delts and maybe the chest by a little bit, there's too much of a gap in overall muscularity for him to win. But since he could pick off the delts because all three heads are separated and bursting full, and maybe the chest too because Nick's chest is flat and not that detailed, I think we can shave a point off of Nick's win. Nick wins in overall size and a couple of other body parts too, but still Nick does win in overall size and a couple of body parts too. I have him clearly in the arms, the midsection, and even the legs. And even in the body parts he lost, like the delts and the chest, they're not that bad. The delts especially are pretty good. Tonio just has that extra pop, literally. So this is going to be a 2-point win for Nick Walker. I really like Tonio's pose and that compact mass just being bursting full and round. He looks a lot like Dexter Jackson in those regards. But going up against Nick is still too difficult. So to end this comparison off, Nick will win the final pose with 2 points. And before we get to the scorecard, let's go over the overall physique categories. Let's start with conditioning. I think both guys were actually very spot on. I even contemplated making this a tie, but I decided to give Nick a slight edge because I think these guys' conditionings were similar, but Tonio had a problem with separation. Both guys were dry, ripped, devoid of water, but Nick had the finer details in a lot of places, especially the lower body, and that was the deciding factor for me. So I'm giving Nick a 1-point win here. Now in terms of muscularity, that's an easy one. I'm giving the win to Nick. I am going to shave off just 1 point though because Tonio is very complete. If Nick had done better in the side chest and in the back poses, I could absolutely have made this a 3-point win. But Tonio did have a well-rounded physique that kept it close enough in some poses to warrant this to be a 2-point win. And in the shape category, that's another no-brainer. Tonio wins that. I gotta be honest though, I think a 3-point win in this category would be more apt for if Tonio went up against someone like Angel Calderon, who is like Nick but even worse. I think Nick's waist was okay and the quad sweep was decent. Tonio had better shape for sure though, so I'm giving him a 2-point win. What I'm trying to say is that to me, a 3-point win has to be reserved for someone like Dave Palumbo going against Tonio Burton. No one is arguing Nick has better shape than Tonio, but he still looks okay, just okay. And I do see this as the same as Nick winning muscularity by 2 points. No one will argue that Tonio is bigger, but Tonio did win a couple of body parts here and there, and he is very complete in his own right. So basically, if I gave Nick 3 points in muscularity, I'd give Tonio 3 points in shape, but I gave both of them 2, so at the end of the day, it's the same deal. And for the flaws, I gotta be honest, Nick is the only one that really has them. Tonio doesn't have the weird structural issues or injuries, so he's safe. Now, Nick has the weird structure in the stubby legs going against him, maybe even the waist, but for this version, that was only a minor flaw, at least to me. I gotta be honest, I don't see Nick's flaws as detrimental as others see them. You don't win almost every pose and have super bad flaws. Even with the stubby legs, he did win poses like the front double and the absent thighs. And from the back and side, you can't even tell they're short and lack the sweep. But again, Tonio doesn't have flaws, but I think 3 points should be reserved for something different. A bicep tear, a true bubble gut, which Nick didn't have at least in this version. So I'm going to give Tonio the 2-point win in this category. So now that that's out of the way, here's the full scorecard. As you can see, Nick got major victories throughout the mandatories, but Tonio did get a narrow win in the overall physique categories. But after adding these up and weighting them accordingly, the mandatories will be worth 2/3 of the comparison, and the overall categories will be worth 1/3. Nick wins 63.3 points to Tonio's 36.7. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with my scale, I will say that this isn't a close win. It's not even just a standard win. I would say it's getting pretty close to a blowout win. Since my system splits 100 points between each guy, most scores will fall in between 60 and 30. But for Nick, he is slowly working his way out of that average tier, and I would say this is definitely a comfortable win. And remember, we chose Nick's Arnold Classic version. We won't get that on the New York Pro stage. We won't even get his previous best version on stage, which would be the 2022 Mr. Olympia. I think he's going to be even better. Of course, that midsection has to be in check though. But given the feedback that Nick has gotten from the guest posing, and the fact that the guest posing was with him having a full stomach, I think the midsection will be under control in New York. And keep in mind, just using the 2022 Olympia version, sure, Tonio would still get the front lat spread and probably the rear lat spread as well, but Nick's margins everywhere else would go up. The side chest and most muscular would go up specifically with Nick's bigger and fuller physique, and in the overall physique categories, he can push that muscularity score to a full 3-point win for sure. Nick bullied Tonio in size even here, and it's not just indiscriminate size in a couple of places. Nick is very complete. Not only is he complete and massive, but he has great conditioning too. What does Tonio have going for him that Nick doesn't? Well, shape. And to be honest, as long as Nick's waistline isn't completely blown out, it's just not going to be enough. Tonio isn't exactly Samson Dauda. Samson was able to beat Nick at the 2023 Arnold with his shape because Samson is huge and his conditioning at that Arnold was at least okay. And even then, a lot of people, including myself, would call that a controversial win. But here, Nick beat Tonio in overall detail by a little, and overall size by just too much. And with that, he won and is going to win most of the mandatories on show day, I would bet. So anyway, can Tonio beat Nick Walker at the 2024 New York Pro? Again, the waist would have have to look absolutely atrocious for Nick, and I don't see that happening. And even if it did, it's not exactly a cakewalk for Tonio, because Nick will still have a great level of size and at minimum equal conditioning. To be honest, I don't even think Tonio will be Nick's #1 competition anymore. I think a new challenger has emerged, but we'll save that for the next episode. So I think Tonio has a chance, but it's statistically 0. If this comparison showed us anything, it's that Tonio can't even compete with a downsized version of Nick Walker. And yeah, with that, Nick Walker is the winner of today's comparison. And for my prediction between those two, I think Nick will firmly be ahead of Tonio at the New York Pro. Even if Tonio can somehow get into second place, which I don't think he will, I still expect to see a noticeable gap between these two come show day. Well, that's going to do it for today's video. This will definitely be one of the main matchups we'll be watching for this weekend, so let me know how you saw this comparison and what you're predicting. And if you guys like these types of videos, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more. By the way, if you guys are looking for any high quality supplements, head over to Arms Race Nutrition. Then to check out, be sure to use my code Project10 for 10% off your entire order. That's code Project10 at armsracenutrition.com. Finally, with all that said, I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.
Gotta get that Lexia.